Europe still reeked of death, not the kind brought by guns, but the kind that licked at human souls and never let go. Inside a small prison on the outskirts of Krakow sat a man whose hands had fed the flames of countless bodies. He didn't pull triggers. He didn't shout orders, yet millions had vanished because of him. His name, Otto Moll. Survivors whispered it like a curse, the furnace keeper. In the crematoriums of Auschwitz, he had been nothing and everything. He was invisible, and yet he held power over life and death. Every flicker of flame, every plume of smoke, it obeyed him, and now the fire that obeyed him would become his. Judge the furnace keeper would soon face the same inferno he once commanded, and history would watch as the man who burned the innocent stared into the abyss he had created. Otto Moll's world was one of whispers, shadows, and smoke. The Auschwitz crematoriums were not grand halls of commands or heroic marches. They were corridors of cold brick and relentless fire. And within those walls, Otto moved like a ghost, unseen yet indispensable. He was not a commander. He carried no uniform of prestige. There were no medals pinned to his chest, no orders shouted across barracks. Instead, he was the engineer of death, the silent keeper of the flames that consumed lives with mechanical precision. Each day he walked past the furnaces, eyes scanning the gauges, hands adjusting valves, his touch exact, almost reverent. To the casual observer, it was mere work, temperature readings, fuel management, steam valves. But those who survived whispered another truth. They spoke of the rhythm of Otto's presence, the methodical way he lit the furnaces, the soft whistle that accompanied the heat, the calmness in his eyes, while the world burned around him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was minimal. After the war, in courtrooms heavy with judgment, he would say simply, "It was my duty, I only worked the machines." The words were simple, almost mundane, but behind them lay a quiet horror. Each adjustment, each movement of Otto's hand, ensured that the fires never faltered, that death continued without pause, without mercy. The machines obeyed him. He fed them, and through them he fed a monstrous system that consumed countless souls. Survivors recounted stories of him with trembling voices, how Otto whistled while bodies burned, how his eyes never wavered, never blinked at the smoke curling from human flesh, how he walked past the screams and sobs of the condemned with the serenity of someone tending a garden. They remembered the precision. The same hands that calibrated valves also seemed to shape the rhythm of terror itself. There was a strange poetry in his silence, a terrifying intimacy in his work. The furnace was alive under Otto's hands, not as an object but as an extension of him. Each ember, each curl of smoke, each wave of heat was a note in a song only he conducted. And for him, the song had no end, until finally the world outside caught up with his silence. In those corridors, the walls themselves seemed to absorb the weight of his presence. The soot-black bricks, the ash in the corners, the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air, all bore witness to the man who did not kill with his own hands, yet ensured that millions perished. Otto Moll had become part of the machinery of death, inseparable from it, both master and servant of a system that demanded obedience over morality. Even as he walked out of the shadows into the light of accountability, there was no trace of theatrics, no flinch or tremor. He remained composed, almost proud in the calm that had terrified those who watched him work. And though the world would judge him as monstrous, there remained an inexplicable fascination. How a man so ordinary in appearance could wield death with such silent, terrifying efficiency. The witnesses spoke cautiously, as if naming him aloud could summon the ghosts he had tended. He whistled, one said, her voice trembling, while the smoke curled and the flames devoured them. Another recalled the gaze, cold, unblinking, indifferent to the wails of the living and the dead alike. Otto Moll never looked away. Each ember reflected in his eyes as if the fire had become part of him. He was not cruel in a theatrical sense. His cruelty was methodical, restrained, almost clinical. Every day the prisoners passed him, fearful and silent. They had learned to read his calm. It was not kindness. It was not mercy. It was a warning, a silent reminder that death could arrive without emotion, without rage, without hesitation. The furnace obeyed him, the flames bending to his touch. He worked as though tending a machine of his own design, precise, controlled, detached. Yet behind that detachment lay a terrifying intimacy with suffering. Otto's life before the war revealed little about this man. He was ordinary in every visible measure, educated, disciplined, unremarkable. And yet, the machinery of Auschwitz transformed ordinariness into a conduit of horror. The camp did not need commanders alone. It needed enablers, quiet operators who could keep the engines of death humming without question. Otto fulfilled that role with silent devotion. In courtrooms years later, when asked about his duty, he repeated with calm simplicity, "I only worked the machines." And that phrase, so understated, concealed the enormity of his deeds. For each machine he operated, each furnace he stoked, carried with it lives lost, families shattered, humanity erased. The weight of those actions hung in the air like smoke, tangible yet invisible, haunting those who survived and those who judged. Even now, historians debate, how does one measure the cruelty of someone who never raised a hand against another? Otto's hands, steady and precise, created a rhythm that was both mechanical and human. The line between duty and monstrosity blurred until it vanished entirely. He fed the flames, and in doing so he fed the insatiable hunger of a system that demanded silence, obedience, and denial. The courtroom was silent, save for the scratch of pens and the distant hum of the old building. Otto Moll stood, unremarkable and composed, as though he were attending to another furnace rather than facing the weight of history. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath. Families of the deceased, survivors with hollow eyes, and the judges all observed him, their gazes heavy with accusation. When asked about the fires, about the screams that had once echoed in the night, Otto's reply remained calm, almost mundane. "I only worked the machines." There was no flinch, no sign of guilt, no tremor in his voice. It was as though the machinery had absorbed his conscience, leaving behind a man defined only by routine, precision, and silence. The horror of his deeds was amplified not by anger or hatred, but by the cold efficiency with which they were executed. Each word spoken in that courtroom carried weight. Survivors recounted the details, the flames, the smoke, the whistling. Otto listened, expression unchanged, a man apart from the chaos, a shadow of humanity framed by the tribunal's lights. Judges conferred. Historians would later note the rarity of such detachment. Here was a man whose crime was measured in temperatures and valves, yet whose hands had shaped the deaths of countless souls. As the verdict was delivered, a hush fell. Death by hanging. Otto's calm gaze did not waver. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging the procedural necessity rather than the moral judgment. Outside, the sky over Krakow remained grey, the smoke of his former workplace rising silently in memory. The man who had fed the flames would soon face the cold, final fire of justice. In the end, history remembered him not as a soldier, not as a commander, but as a keeper of the inferno, a man who allowed horror to burn quietly, methodically, and efficiently. And as he was led from the courtroom, the lingering question remained, how ordinary can evil become before it is no longer recognizable? After the collapse of the Third Reich, Germany was a land of silence and rubble. Cities lay in ruin, streets were littered with the remains of lives destroyed, and the air still carried the bitter scent of smoke and iron. In this devastated landscape moved Otto Moll, a man who had been invisible to history for so long. He walked under a false name, a worker among workers in a small coal factory near Munich. His hands, once instruments of death in the crematoriums of Auschwitz, now blackened only by coal dust. Yet even in anonymity, the past has a way of clawing back. In 1946, a survivor from Auschwitz entered that factory. Her eyes, haunted and sharp, scanned the men laboring in silence, and then recognition. Otto Moll, the man who had whistled while flames consumed bodies, the man who had never once flinched at the smoke of death. Within seconds, the machinery of justice began to move. Otto was arrested quietly, with no resistance. As if the chains themselves were part of some larger mechanism, he was meant to operate. Inside the prison, the world was reduced to walls' shadows and the faint echo of past atrocities. A small mirror hung on one wall, cracked at the edges, reflecting a man who could no longer hide behind coal dust or false identity. Otto gazed at his own eyes, searching for the boy who had once joined the SS, or the engineer who had obeyed orders without question. All he found was the furnace keeper staring back. The first night in the cell, he sat on the hard cot, listening to the drip of water from a leaking pipe. The silence was oppressive. It was the kind of silence that remembered every scream, every cry, every soul reduced to ash. He did not speak to the guards. He did not ask for comfort, he did not cry. Only the mirror reflected the question that haunted him now. If he had refused, would he have burned too? In the dim light, Otto's hands traced the frame of the mirror, remembering the flames, the heat, the lifeless faces staring up at him as he kept the fire alive. The memories were not just recollections. They were living ghosts, each one whispering in the shadows of his mind. Even as he closed his eyes, he could see the fire flicker behind his eyelids. Relentless and accusing, he slept little that night, and when dawn crept through the small barred window, it cast long skeletal shadows across the floor. Otto rose, washed his face in cold water, and stared at the reflection one last time before leaving the cell for interrogation. His composure remained unbroken, though beneath it stirred a maelstrom of thought, fragments of memory, whispers of faces, the unbearable weight of silence. Each step down the corridor was a march not toward freedom, but toward reckoning. Guards watched, silent and impassive, while Otto's mind wandered back to Auschwitz. He remembered the hiss of the crematorium doors, the heat that made skin crawl, the ashes that fell like snow. And he remembered the faces, eyes wide, mouths open in silent scream, and how he had kept the fire alive. At the end of the hallway, a small window let in a pale morning light. Otto paused, his reflection faint in the glass. For the first time, he saw himself not as a man of routine, a mere operator of machinery, but as a participant in something beyond comprehension. The mirror had always been there, a silent witness to his solitude. Now it bore witness to judgment. He whispered once, almost to himself, a confession hidden in the monotone of his voice. It's strange. I still dream of fire, no one heard it, and yet the words were heavy, carrying decades of unspoken horrors, the mechanical obedience that had fed flames and destroyed lives. The mirror reflected the same eyes that had stared through smoke for years, unflinching, unrepentant, yet now burdened with inevitability. Outside, the city stirred, oblivious to the man imprisoned behind walls, oblivious to the weight of fire and ash that had followed him like a shadow. Inside, Otto sat alone with memory, reflection, and the haunting understanding that no human machinery could erase what had been done. Each night would bring the same torment, the smoke, the heat, the faces, and the endless question, could one obey and still remain human? This night in the cell, the mirror and the silence became Otto's confessional. The past pressed against him with the force of history itself, showing no mercy, offering no reprieve. And as he lay on the cot, staring into the faint reflection of his own eyes, he understood a simple truth: some flames cannot be extinguished. Not by time, not by hiding, not even by the cold walls of a prison. The days in prison stretched endlessly, each one a mirror of the last. Otto Moll walked the narrow corridors, the walls pressing close, as if the very stones remembered every soul that had passed through fire. He did not speak unless necessary. Guards noted his silence, but could not read the storm behind his eyes. For Otto, silence was not obedience. It was a shield, a thin veil separating him from the past that refused to fade. At night, alone in his cell, he relived every step he had taken within Auschwitz. The heat of the furnaces burned behind his eyelids. The bodies, pale and lifeless, were stacked like kindling, and through it all he had walked, precise, methodical, calm. The smoke had never stung his throat. The screams had never broken his focus. It was as if a different part of him had watched from above, detached, observing a machine he himself had operated. Interrogations were scheduled, but Otto offered little. Questions about victims, about orders, about duty, met only with a soft, unwavering monotone. I only followed the procedures. The machines required tending. That was all. His words were simple, stripped of justification or remorse. Yet in their simplicity lay a terror, the ordinary phrasing of extraordinary horror. Each answer was a ghost, echoing through the sterile room, settling into the minds of the prosecutors who struggled to reconcile humanity with monstrosity. One night, a visitor came, a survivor brought to confront him. She was older, her eyes hollowed by memory, her body trembling with years of hidden pain. She spoke first, voice brittle. "Do you hear them? The ones who cannot speak?" Otto did not flinch. He nodded slightly, not in apology but acknowledgement. For him, the dead had never stopped speaking. They had simply become part of the machinery, voices woven into the perpetual hum of the crematoriums. Sleep offered no relief. Each hour was haunted by the crackle of flames, the whisper of ash, the ghostly shuffle of the condemned. Otto wrote little. He scribbled numbers, calculations, and sometimes lines about fire, almost as if trying to map the path of his guilt. The mirror in his cell reflected not the man alone, but a phantom tethered to endless smoke and unending questions. He began to wonder, could one obey the law of machinery and still be judged human? Or was humanity a luxury reserved for those who never fed flames with their own hands? Through winter and into spring, the interrogations continued. Witnesses described every detail: Otto's calm whistling, his lack of emotion, the precision with which he tended the fires. Prosecutors leaned forward, trying to detect remorse, to draw out fear. Yet Otto remained a study in detachment, each word clipped, each glance measured. For him, the flames were never gone, the smoke never vanished, the memories never dulled. And each night, when the world outside slept, he stared into the blackness, seeing the glow of a furnace he could never escape. The cell became both sanctuary and crucible. Shadows stretched long across the floor, merging with the faint light from the barred window. Otto paced slowly, counting steps, counting seconds, haunted by the inevitability of judgment. He did not cry. He did not plead. Only the quiet tremor of memory shook him, a reminder that actions, no matter how mechanically executed, left stains that time could not erase. By the end of this period, Otto had become a ghost within walls, a man suspended between the world he had known and the world that demanded justice. Every reflection, every whisper, every shadow carried the weight of lives extinguished. And he understood, finally, that some fires do not burn out, no matter how far one walks from the furnace. The courtroom was cold, its walls echoing the whispers of a world trying to reconcile horror with justice. Otto Moll entered, not with arrogance, not with fear, only an almost mechanical calm. His uniform was gone, replaced by plain clothes, but the weight of the past clung to him like smoke. Every step was measured, every glance fleeting yet deliberate. He walked as one who had tended fire for years, and now faced the flames of scrutiny himself. Witnesses were called, one after another. Survivors spoke with trembling voices, detailing each moment, each breath, each look Otto had given, while bodies vanished into the furnace. Each account was precise, detailed, and unrelenting. Prosecutors leaned forward, desperate for a crack, a sign of human emotion that might explain or justify. Yet Otto remained a ghost behind the glass of memory, nodding only once or tilting his head slightly, as if hearing but not feeling. When he was asked for his own words, his reply was brief, chilling in its simplicity. "I obeyed the orders. I worked the machines. That is all." Silence fell, heavy, pressing against every listener. It was not defiance. It was clarity. The kind of clarity only someone who had walked alongside death without blinking could possess. For the first time, many in the room understood that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it works quietly, steadily like a heartbeat, unnoticed until it is too late. Outside the courtroom, the sky was grey, draping the city in a muted veil of ash. Otto's mind wandered back to the furnaces, to the whistling, to the smoke curling like fingers in the darkness. Could one truly measure the weight of a life spent tending fire? Could justice ever touch the mind that had long ago divorced itself from humanity? He wondered fleetingly if remorse could ever pierce the armor of obedience. Perhaps it could not. Perhaps it was too late. As the verdict approached, every eye in the courtroom seemed to converge on him. Each tick of the clock became a hammer, shaping the inevitable. Death was no longer a distant flame. It was a shadow creeping closer, silent but inexorable. Otto's calm did not falter. He understood, perhaps more than anyone, the finality of what awaited. The furnace he had once controlled was now metaphorical, waiting to consume him whole. When the judge pronounced the sentence, Otto neither flinched nor smiled. He simply nodded, a mechanical acknowledgement of justice delivered. For the world outside, this was closure. For Otto, it was a continuation. The fires of memory and guilt would never cool. And in that moment, all who watched understood that some men are forged in the silence of destruction, and no tribunal can undo the echo of their deeds. The morning was heavy with mist, each droplet hanging like memory in the cold December air. Otto Moll, the furnace keeper, was led through the prison corridors, footsteps echoing against stone walls that had witnessed countless lives end. Guards flanked him, but he walked with a quiet inevitability, as if the path had been set long before his capture. The same hands that tended fire now trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of the moments he had endured and inflicted. He passed other prisoners, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Some whispered prayers, others looked away, unwilling to witness the final act. Otto did not flinch. He knew the ritual, the mechanics, the unavoidable truth. The gallows stood ahead, wooden and somber, a stark monument to justice rendered cold. A crowd had gathered, officials and civilians alike, all eager to see the culmination of a nightmare made flesh. When he was asked for final words, Otto's voice remained low, controlled, almost detached. "I obeyed. I worked, that is all. No plea, no regret. Just a statement of fact, like reading a line from a ledger." It was terrifying in its simplicity, a reflection of a life compartmentalized into duty and fire, void of empathy. The executioner moved silently, rope coiled, steps measured. Otto placed his hands on the wooden beam, eyes briefly scanning the witnesses. Some recoiled, unable to meet his gaze. Others stared, trying to etch every detail into memory. Then the trapdoor opened. In an instant, the furnace keeper was gone. The echo of the fall lingered longer than any cry, a final punctuation on a life spent feeding flames. Yet in the minds of those who watched, his calm, measured demeanor remained. It was not the scream that haunted them, but the absence of one. It was the human capacity for detachment, for obedience without conscience, that lingered far longer than any mortal life. In that instant, history whispered the truth. Some men's deeds cannot be washed clean, no matter the sentence, no matter the fall. May 28, 1947. The dawn was pale and hesitant, a grey light filtering through the fog that hugged the cobblestone streets of Krakow. Otto Moll, once the silent engineer of the crematoriums, now walked toward the gallows with a slow, measured step. The air was thick with the smell of cold stone and damp earth, a reminder that even in a city scarred by war, life pressed onward. Each footfall echoed against the walls of the prison courtyard, a grim metronome counting down the minutes of a life that had kept so many others, final ones, in fire. Prisoners and guards alike lined the path. Their faces, etched with the shadows of loss and terror, turned toward him in anticipation. Some could not look. Others stared, trying to see the man behind the legend, the one who had watched smoke curl from chimneys while bodies vanished into flame. Otto did not flinch, did not hesitate. His eyes, dark and distant, reflected nothing but the inevitability of what was to come. As he approached the gallows, he passed the crowd in silence. Mothers, fathers, survivors of horrors long past, each carried their own private memory of the man now facing the rope. And yet he remained unreadable, a mirror of his former life, detached, almost clinical, as if emotion had been drained from him like heat from the furnaces he once tended. The executioner awaited him, a figure of quiet professionalism, coiled rope in hand, posture rigid yet practiced, ready to carry out the final act of justice. When asked for his last words, Otto's voice emerged calm, almost resigned. "I am sorry, but I don't know for what anymore." There was no flourish, no defiance, only the faint whisper of a man lost to the enormity of his own deeds, standing on the threshold between life and death. It was the paradox of someone who had wielded power over mortality without personal consequence, now facing it without defense. And then, in the blink of an eye, the lever dropped. The trapdoor opened, and Otto Moll became one with the space he had once used to consume others. The crowd exhaled as if the air itself had been held too long, and in that silence, the weight of years of fire and obedience settled into the cold morning light. Outside, the chimneys of Krakow stood still. For the first time in decades, the smoke that had haunted so many streets, so many dreams, was gone. The furnaces lay cold, a silent monument to the man who had fed them with eerie diligence. And for those who had watched, the image of his calm resignation lingered longer than any sound, a stark reminder that justice, while delayed, eventually finds its way. The executioner's hand rested briefly on the lever, a simple motion that carried the weight of decades of pain, loss, and memory. Otto Moll stood perfectly still, his posture upright, almost formal, as if he were still supervising the furnaces he once tended. Every eye in the courtyard followed the motion, some with horror, others with grim satisfaction. The cold morning air seemed to hold its breath. For a man who had watched countless lives end in flames, this moment was ironically intimate. His own mortality presented plainly, without smoke or fire, only gravity and inevitability. He did not flinch. He did not speak. Even in the seconds before the drop, there was a strange serenity in his gaze, a detachment that had defined him through years of unspeakable acts. Then the trapdoor gave way. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty morning, a sharp punctuation to the long, haunting sentence of his life. The crowd gasped, some turning their faces away, others unable to look. And in that instant, Otto Moll ceased to exist in the world above, leaving behind the man who had kept countless furnaces alive, who had fed the fire that devoured so many innocents. But the memory of him remained. His calm, even in death, became another story to be told by survivors and historians alike. The paradox of Otto Moll, the man who had caused so much suffering without seeming cruelty, now meeting a quiet end, lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. His final breath, swallowed by the cold morning air, marked not just the end of a man, but the conclusion of a dark chapter in a world desperately trying to heal. Outside the prison walls, the streets were quiet. The smoke of countless past fires had dissipated, leaving only the sharp scent of cold stone and wet earth. It was as though the city itself had exhaled, the chimneys of Krakow finally at rest. And though Otto was gone, the shadow of the fires he had tended remained, a reminder of what obedience without conscience can create. The courtyard emptied quickly, leaving behind only the echoes of the condemned man's final steps. Otto Moll's body, once so full of purpose and quiet menace, now lay motionless, a stark reminder of the human face behind unspeakable horrors. The morning sun struck the wet cobblestones, glinting off the rain-soaked prison walls, casting long shadows where the crowd had stood moments ago. Inside, guards cleaned the trapdoor, their movements automatic, almost robotic. There was no celebration, only the solemn routine of a world trying to impose order on chaos. Yet even as life returned to normal, the weight of memory lingered. Otto Moll had been a figure who did not shout, did not command armies, but whose daily choices had created death on an unimaginable scale. The fire he had fed was gone, but its imprint remained. Historians would later debate his psychology. Was he a man lost to duty, or a willing participant in evil's machinery? Survivors whispered of his whistle, of the calmness with which he monitored the furnaces, of eyes that never turned away. And now those same observers had watched him face mortality with the same eerie composure. The paradox remained. A man who had caused so much pain without overt cruelty, meeting a quiet, almost clinical end. Outside, the chimneys that had once smoked day and night were cold. No flames rose to the sky, no acrid scent lingered in the air. It was as though the world had paused to mourn, to recognize the end of a chapter written in smoke and silence. And yet memory is not extinguished. In every historical account, every survivor testimony, Otto Moll lives on, a warning that obedience without conscience can leave marks far deeper than any physical scar. The day progressed quietly, the sun climbing higher. Guards moved efficiently. Historians took notes and photographers documented the empty courtyard. But in the spaces between shadows and light, in the gaps left by what had been, the story of Otto Moll remained, a man whose hands had tended fire, whose gaze had never wavered, and whose end was both deserved and eerily silent. In the end, the fires were gone, but the lesson remained. Humanity's capacity for evil often wears a mask of ordinariness, of duty performed without question. And when such men are finally held to account, the world watches and remembers. The story of Otto Moll is not one that screams of wild madness or grotesque theatrics. It is quieter, subtler, yet far more haunting. In the post-war silence of Europe, where rubble and ruin still breathed the memory of violence, Otto walked among ordinary streets with an ordinary face. He did not command armies. He did not strike fear with shouts. He worked each day, maintaining the fires that consumed lives with methodical precision. To those who witnessed him in the camps, Otto seemed almost invisible, blending into the machinery of destruction. But invisibility is deceptive. It is often the quiet, meticulous hand that shapes the deadliest horrors. His duty was simple, almost banal. Check the furnaces, adjust the valves, keep the flames alive. Yet in that simplicity lay the weight of millions of lives erased. What makes Otto so terrifying is the ordinariness of his choices. He did not need to shout. He did not need to beat anyone. He merely obeyed, and that obedience, that silent compliance, became a weapon more effective than rage. History has shown time and again that it is not only the monsters in shadows who destroy, it is the men who claim duty over conscience. After his execution, the furnaces remained cold, yet their absence could not erase the lingering echoes of smoke and ash. Survivors would remember the whistling, the eyes that never flinched, the calm precision of a man feeding death while the world watched silently. And in remembering, the world holds a mirror to its own potential, to the quiet, bureaucratic evil that can thrive behind the guise of work and obedience. Otto's name is not shouted in terror. It is whispered in archives, in survivor testimonies, in the gaps between lines of history books. He represents something deeply human and deeply frightening. The capacity for cruelty not born of passion but of duty, a duty performed without question. Even decades later, the echo of Otto Moll's actions lingers, not in loud, violent scenes, but in quiet corridors, in empty rooms, in the still air where nothing moves yet everything weighs heavy. He was a man who obeyed, a man who followed instructions, a man whose hands never trembled while the world burned. The horror lies not in the flames, but in the ordinariness of the one who tended them. Survivors recounted seeing him move among the crematoriums, whistling softly, as though the music could cleanse his conscience. But no music can absolve a man who feeds fire with human flesh. He never questioned. He never faltered. He simply did his job, a task that demanded nothing more than a lack of empathy. And that perhaps is what makes his story resonate more than others. The idea that evil is not always monstrous. Sometimes it is methodical, rational, almost bureaucratic. Otto's life after capture offered no redemption. Behind prison walls he faced silence, a silence that could not be broken by whistling or the smoke of furnaces. He confronted memories he could not deny, though he tried in small ways to claim detachment. "It was my duty," he repeated, a mantra of absolution. But duty is not innocence. Duty does not erase the eyes that watched flames consume people. Duty does not silence the ghosts that linger long after the fire is cold. In these reflections, history speaks not only of Otto, but of all those who choose obedience over humanity. The man who fed the fire became a mirror, a reflection of what ordinary people can do when rules replace conscience, when systems replace morality, when silence replaces thought. This is the true terror of his legacy, that it asks us to examine ourselves, our decisions, and our willingness to look away while the world burns around us. History books may reduce Otto to a name, a date, a punishment served. But memory preserves him in a more honest form, a man who smiled in the presence of destruction, who never faltered while death whispered, and who reminds us that some of the worst crimes in history are performed not by beasts, but by those who are merely human. The furnaces are silent now. Their chimneys stand as empty sentinels, blackened by the smoke that once rose in endless columns. Yet in memory the fire remains. Otto Moll's presence lingers, not as a figure of grotesque spectacle, but as a quiet, unyielding force of obedience. He reminds us that horror often wears no mask. It walks in daylight, blends among people, and follows orders without question. Those who witnessed his execution claimed that his last moments were almost ordinary. A man facing death, eyes forward, body rigid, voice calm, no tears, no outcry, just silence. And yet in that silence, an entire history whispered. The screams of those who never escaped the flames, the faces of those whose lives ended in smoke. Otto's death did not undo what he had done. It did not ease the burden of memory or relieve the weight of conscience. It only gave the world a sense of closure, fragile and incomplete. Historians debate the nature of obedience. Psychologists dissect the mind of the man who fed fire. But beyond analysis lies the undeniable truth. The worst crimes are often performed not by those driven by madness or hatred alone, but by those who accept tasks without moral hesitation. Otto's story is a chilling reminder that humanity can be the quietest witness to its own capacity for cruelty. In the empty rooms, in the ashes scattered across what remains of the crematorium grounds, one truth persists. Evil is not always loud, not always monstrous. Sometimes it is methodical, sometimes it is calm, sometimes it is someone like Otto Moll, a man who did what he was told, and in doing so fed the fires that consumed countless lives. And so we remember. Not only the victims, not only the fires, but the man who tended them, the face behind the smoke, the quiet obedience that allowed history's darkest chapters to unfold. His legacy is not just in death, but in the questions he leaves behind, questions about morality, conscience, and the responsibility each of us bears when confronted with acts we cannot ignore. Even now, decades later, the lesson endures. When humanity sleeps while duty reigns, fire can rise, and no one will be immune to its heat.